Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 9 on political economies. The purpose of this chapter is to cover some of the main concepts that relate to politics and the economy. So there are some economic concepts that we're going to briefly touch on. As your book establishes in terms of a definition, political economy refers to an intersection of politics and economics. In other words, how do these two forces impact one another? So there are a lot of questions related to power and the exercise of economic devices, but there's also a lot of questions that we've already covered when we think about Marx, for example, and Adam Smith, thinking about how the economy and political systems are intertwined and how economic systems can impact the amount of power that people have. So there's very much a feedback between the politics and the economic system of any particular country. So this is a very important kind of perspective to apply to politics. So it usually causes us to analyze questions like the distribution of wealth, the division of labor in society, as well as the government's role in preventing poverty and providing health care and other important questions that relate to productivity, industry, and the ability to gain wealth. So wealth is one of the dominant motivations for really the state system in general. So it's not surprising that we look at how to measure wealth as an important indication of the type of political economy or even just economic system that we're looking at. So different ways that we measure wealth at both at the country level, but also trying to get an idea of what kind of wealth is shared by the population. Gross domestic product is the most commonly used, and this is the total value of goods and services, the total value of the productivity of a country in a given year. GDP per capita is essentially the overall wealth generated by a country divided by its population. And this is an interesting sort of way to measure wealth because it only really tells you a theoretical number because we don't have very much equality in our system. It does not make sense to really give an average of GDP per capita because that average, by the way, in the United States is close to $60,000. We also look at the level of industrialization as a measure of wealth of countries at the macroeconomic scale. And this refers to essentially the degree to which they have begun to rely on manufacturing in a given country. And this also leads to consumption societies and the creation of skilled workers. In addition, some countries have moved past an industrial phase into a post-industrial phase, and they've remained wealthy. This is the United States, Western Europe, Australia. And this is where the majority of the economy is actually concentrated on service sector employment. This includes financial transfers and banking, some very expensive types of enterprises, but it also refers to service sector employment like fast food. So another way that we measure wealth or look at how wealth is distributed is through the Gini index. And the Gini index is a measure of inequality between people in the economy. So that inequality refers to really the distance between the very wealthy and the very poor. And with the Gini index, the higher the score, the more inequality exists between income. So take a moment to locate where the United States is. This looks like a pretty intimidating table, but if you pay attention, it's really informative. What we have here is the GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity. And essentially, this is a mathematical adjustment to currencies around the world that accounts for how much they can actually buy, kind of your basic bundle of goods that keeps a family going. How much of that does the currency buy? And so the size of the economy is captured in this graph, as well as sort of the amount of money that is that their currency buys. Another way that we analyze the exchange between economy and politics is to evaluate market versus command economies. These are two major types of economic systems in the world. So a market economy is one very much like the United States professes to be, and we have an emphasis on private property, free exchange of goods and services, and not a lot of government regulation. Although we have a pretty extensive regulatory framework in the United States regarding businesses and consumer rights and the environment. Of course, there are people who believe that those should be even stronger than they are. Market economies operate off of a philosophy known as comparative advantage, which is a very popular 18th and 19th century economic theory that looked at the global markets and said that states should sort of identify those areas where they could produce goods with high quality, but cheaper than their competitor countries. Again, this is related to some of the things we've talked about before, like the role of the government in the economy. Adam Smith's view of the prosperity of the United States coming from capitalism, the idea of an invisible hand that really self-corrects markets. And this contrasts very strongly with the idea of a command economy where states actually make the important economic decisions. And we mostly associate this with socialism or communism. And like with many concepts that we cover in this class, they're really ideal forms when we're talking about these concepts, command versus capitalist economy, because neither of these really exist in a pure form. The closest that we do have to a pure form of a command economy was the USSR and the People's Republic of China. During these very specified time frames. What we actually find in the world today are mixes of market economies and socialist command economies. And we often call this Keynesian. This is named after a famous economist from the 1930s and 40s. His name was Maynard Keynes, Keynes. And he argued that you needed socialist policies to actually make capitalism function. You needed some kind of safety net for people who were not competitive, which is required for capitalism and for that kind of growth that is associated with capitalism. But you couldn't just let people languish and get sick and die. So you needed some sort of supports for the working class especially. And in a capitalist economy, the idea would be that if we were a pure capitalist economy in the United States, we really wouldn't have much of a regulatory framework when it came to labor rights or environmental rights. The government would really just be there to protect private property. The fact that the most capitalistic economies still have quite a bit of involvement of their government sort of is proof of the point. The fact that we issue tariffs, our government makes money. It is actually the only one that is allowed to issue money. And the fact that they levy taxes. These are all really important ways that the government is involved. And this is just some more data about that previous point that reveals the very advanced economies actually do have some elements of socialism built in. And that is one way to capture that is through the amount of government spending around the world. And finally, something I encourage you to look deeper into in the text is this comparison between the United States, Malaysia, and Germany. And they kind of represent the mixed economies, but three different approaches. The U.S. is very much committed to free markets, whereas Germany is committed to welfare state redistribution, and Malaysia is still trying to develop. And you can see that neither of these really is a guaranteed approach to creating extra money in the economy. The GDP doesn't necessarily rise with our very free market approach.